What's up, everyone? It's Adar coming at you with another episode of Startup Engineering Daily. Let's hop right into it. So our first tweet is from Guillermo talking about communicating with LLMs, and essentially he says the effectiveness of your AI usage will be a function of the breadth and precision of your vocabulary. We deem a person a clear thinker when the words they communicate with enhance your model of the world. If you're asking AI to draft an email or vibe code an app, a simple prompt will get you M dashes or purple gradients. Clear thinking and expression will get you much further, like the difference between small talk about the weather versus someone offering you a novel idea or even an insightful new lens of the world around you. And then he just goes on to promote skills, which are good, and he basically labels that as like a shortcut. And I think this is very interesting. I do want to push back on this though, because it's like, what do you need to say besides like don't use M dashes and don't use purple gradients to get a result that's better than this? But I think the idea that's kind of laced in here is much more fascinating, which also gets to this reply from this guy Arjun, who says the cheat code is asking the model to help you find the right vocabulary, e.g. before we start explain basic design and animation terms to me so I can work with you to build this as a cheat code. And I totally agree with this. When AI first started getting really popular, I was personally already on a wave of thinking that like a big part of proving competence is actually the ability to use jargon correctly and be able to use like terms that are industry standards correctly. And I know a lot of people hate jargon and think it's useless, but in my opinion, actually, it's a very good way to learn how the industry works and how to communicate with other people in the industry, which is what people use to determine competence, at least at a surface level. So I always ask my AI and like my OpenClaw to like use as much jargon as possible, because it really makes it easier to operate within these industries that have already refined these ideas a lot. So I just think that's interesting, and it does really speak to like how important prompting is, not just the models. And obviously the models get better and can infer things, but prompting is a very important piece of the puzzle. Next, we have a tweet from George Pugh, who we also talked about yesterday, but this tweet specifically focuses on Cursor's valuation history, which he shows in the past like a year and a half has gone from 400 mil to 50 billion. So that's 120x in 1.5 years. So that's incredible, especially at the scale of this level. And he's saying that the number stopped meaning anything a long time ago. I don't know if this is true. Their ARR must be massive. I remember when they reached 100 mil, like I think this was when they raised at a 10 billion valuation, and it was very big news at the time, but now they're looking to raise at a $50 billion valuation. But it makes a lot of sense. Cursor is extremely popular. Obviously, it's so interesting how it was originally a VS Code fork, and on Hacker News, which is like the classic, people were hating on it, but it actually turned out to be a massive, massive company. So I'm actually bullish on Cursor. I don't use it for anything besides file viewing personally, because I just use Claude Code so much, but my colleagues do use Cursor a lot. So I know it still has deep, deep market penetration, and it's also independent of any model. So they kind of have that middleman moat as well. Like Claude Code is never going to support a ChatGPT model, even if that model is the best practice, whereas Cursor is always the first to support every model that it can, and also you can use open source models and plug them in however you want. Next, we have an interesting back and forth from Reese Sullivan, who used to work at Vercel and is now working at OpenCode, and he is actually a big fan of MCP, which is Model Context Protocol, which is essentially APIs, but for LLMs. And it was developed by Anthropic about a year ago, I would say. And it's gone a lot of up and down, because originally, when it was first developed, a lot of companies released their MCPs immediately, but they just performed very poorly and they didn't do what they said. And, it's kind of that issue of like making sure that the LLMs respect the context. Like, it's not enough to just have the context. It also needs to be like framed in a way that they're going to respect it and execute on it. But Reese says that MCP unlocks behavior that is fundamentally impossible to get via CLI or APIs, and his example is that bad auth, too much context usage, etc., all get solved with an execution layer, and that speaks to his project that he's working on called executor.sh. But I don't know specifically what he is arguing that MCP unlocks that is impossible to get via CLI or APIs, because especially CLI, it seemed like the industry was kind of moving towards that as like the standard, because you don't need to give all the context up front. And this is where we talked about Cloudflare's MCP rewrite as well, where they changed from like listing all of the tools available to just having a search and an execute tool. Whereas like a CLI, for example, always has like a help command, where you can get all the context that you need, but you don't need to inject it into every single prompt. The AI can just operate as needed. But I do agree that MCP is kind of like a harness on top of these APIs, as well as skills, which gives you like a context layer that you can operate within. But he is replying to Gary Tan, who says MCP sucks. And, Gary Tan, you can love him or hate him, but, vibe coding like a 300,000 line of code blog is something. But Reese has this blog where he goes into the idea of the execution layer, and he says LLMs are in desperate need of execution. And he says he hates the way tool calling works, so he built a fix for it, and he's just kind of promoting his project. But I do think it's very interesting, like where is the industry going? When I communicate with like Jira, for example, from Claude Code, I'm using the connectors, which is recommended to me by my colleague and uses MCP under the hood, and it works quite well. I don't necessarily think that there's any benefit for it specifically compared to if I was going to use like an Atlassian CLI, but nonetheless, it is kind of this protocol that is being used a lot in the AI industry, and it is interesting to see people like kind of iterating on these ideas, and obviously they're going to improve over time. And we're all chasing the goal of just making sure that the LLMs operate with these external services as well as possible, because obviously we're not going to rewrite every single external service. We're going to have to communicate with each other. APIs are still a very valuable tool, and we'll just have to stay up to date on this moving forward. Next, we have a tweet from this guy, Blake Anderson, who was an early investor in CalAI, I believe, and he also started some projects of his own. I forget exactly which, but he's been very successful in like the growth hacking and indie app development scene. And obviously CalAI just got acquired, and I think he was an early investor and was also very hands-on advisor is what Zach said about him. But he says the next $1 trillion product will be the AI Workspace. Humans work with agents to manage context and execute. He says he's been working on this for the past few months, but it's become clear that the big labs will move faster, Perplexity, Replit, so he's planning to open source his project. I think this is very fascinating as well. I think that Jira and Linear, which are like the main project management quote-unquote workspaces for building things, have not adapted well enough to AI. I personally don't use Linear, so I could be wrong here and they could be doing great. But kind of like Blake says in the replies here, like you won't be able to retrofit it. I do think you kind of have to build from the ground up, or at least revisit the primitives that you're operating in. So I have a project as well called AI Make that I was working on. I kind of stepped back from it because I'm really believing in like focusing on the projects and the commitments that I have, as opposed to going breadth first, just going super deep with AI to make sure that the projects I'm working on succeed as much as possible. But within that, I did kind of realize as well, it's like you still need to do the work, you still need to drive the taste, but the actual piece of like moving tickets around or refactoring tickets, because that's very common, is like you notice that a problem is bigger than you expected, so you want to break it down into tasks. And AI is just so good for doing those things that it doesn't make sense for humans to do those things anymore. I know you can use Claude Code, obviously, with MCP, with Jira, or with Linear, and you can have it do those things for you, but it will be interesting to see a company that really tackles that head on and does it native out of the box, where it's almost fully AI. Like kind of my thesis as well is like you're not even going to be moving the cards anymore. It's all going to be through chat. So we'll have to see. When he open sources his project, I'll try to cover it as well. I'll make sure to follow him. Okay, next I just wanted to show this cool little thing because I do come from like a kind of design and products background as well. So I just found this super fascinating, and we have a tweet from Andy Allen, who runs Not Boring Software, which does like these basic apps like weather, calculator, stuff like that, I believe. But they're all like super beautiful, 3D oriented, based on theming. And he's quoting this tweet from this guy Ryan Steven, who does design at Microsoft. And it's just a beautiful calendar that this guy built. And to Andy's point, which I totally agree, it's like we have the technology to do so much more with software besides just like the flat, simplistic startups that we've had for like basically since the late 2010s, I would say, is kind of when that style was really bought in by all of these companies. But the cycles of trends and fashion and all of that, maybe we'll get back to like isomorphic, I think it's called, or I don't know what the word is, but like where things look realistic and are 3D and stuff. This is a great example of what the future could be holding, and it is very beautiful and aesthetic. Next, we have this tweet from Steve Young. There was a better tweet I saw as well from this guy Jonathan Liu. I forget what product he works on, but essentially it's showing this Apple Pay for subscriptions within apps, which is part of the legislation or court decisions that were part of the Apple lawsuit. I believe with Epic Games is actually who really decided it, or who really pushed it forward, where now you can pay through Stripe for subscriptions on apps. So you don't need to pay the 30% like walled garden tax. You only need to pay 5% for Stripe is the example here. And it's just really fascinating. It looks really beautiful. Like, I don't think users would have any problem with this. So if you do have an app that takes subscriptions, definitely worth looking into. Obviously, it will take some time to build and handle the webhooks and all these different things. But if you're using RevenueCat, I think they do support it out the box. I could be wrong there, but I believe they do have support for web paywalls, which is essentially what this is. Even though it's directly built in, it's like supporting like the external payment system from Apple, and just super fascinating. And it'll be interesting to see how the industry evolves here as well, because Apple obviously doesn't want to lose their 30%, but they're kind of being court mandated to support it. I think there was some talk about like how if you support like the external payments, you also need to support native Apple payments. But nonetheless, this is a very beautiful Apple Pay modal, and I don't think consumers would have any problem with paying for this. Whereas like if you actually linked out to an external website, I do think you would lose conversion. Next, we just have this article from Guillermo. Obviously, Vercel's been super deep in the AI game, and I'm a big fan of them. I've been using them to host a lot of things. Personally, though, I have been moving towards Expo just because I feel like in the age of AI, we are going to want to be building full stack applications and cross-platform applications that go from mobile and web using the same code base, just using like conditionals to render things differently is my thesis, but I could be wrong. But he talks about this idea of like anti-fragile infrastructure, and he goes into some points that he finds are important, and obviously like Vercel supports a lot of these, but that makes sense because he's standing behind his word. But he's saying preview and branch deployments, instant rollbacks and atomicity, first class flag support, anti-fragile compute, so if a single node server runs out of memory or crashes, at best you drop traffic. I don't know exactly what he means here though, compared to like other serverless. In the event of a backend timing out or provider becoming unhealthy, we dynamically adjust concurrency and only bill for active CPU. I thought that is how serverless works, but maybe there's some nuance here that I'm missing. Designed for autonomy, which is very interesting. He's saying it's the new observability. Obviously, I think observability is very, very important. I actually think it's like one of the first things you should be working on when building a service that you plan to release to the public, because then you can have visibility into these problems. We kind of talked about that yesterday. Like if AI with just Datadog and Sentry could solve every problem, that remains to be seen. But nonetheless, he's using this idea of autonomy to go beyond observability, where instead of humans having to view these things, the agents can automatically detect anomalies. And then just secure access for deployment, where he's talking about SSO, which is interesting. I don't know how that really affects like startups at the very beginning, but as you get bigger, obviously you would want to own these things and these custom domains, and built-in infrastructure redundancy at every level. Region level redundancy, anycast network level redundancy. I don't know exactly what that is, but I think it's like how IPs are transmitted or made available to the public. Maybe DNS, I could be completely misguided here, but just every level of having redundancy is very important, and the more important your live service is, the more you have to worry about these things, whereas Vercel doesn't have much outages, and that probably speaks to this number 7 that they're very focused on and honed in very deeply. Next, we have this tweet from this guy Chris Lobb, which is very fascinating, where it's a paper that apparently came out from Alibaba. I haven't read the paper, so I can't speak to this. I can only speak to what the tweet says here, but he says Alibaba tested 18 AI coding agents on 100 real code bases spanning 233 days each. They failed spectacularly, and it speaks to the idea of like passing tests once is easy, maintaining code for 8 months without breaking everything is where AI completely collapses, according to this claim. They have this benchmark SWE CI, which measures long-term code maintenance instead of one-shot bug fixes. Each task tracks 71 consecutive commits of real evolution. And it says that 75% of models break previously working code during maintenance, which is hilarious. I wonder how that compares to humans. I would say it's probably not too far off, but it's hard to maintain code and not break things. Like the only code that doesn't break is code you never touch, right? And that's why the banks are using like 70-year-old code or whatever, like Fortran or whatever. That's why personally I am a big fan of like these AI code review tools like BugBot and CodeRabbit are, in my opinion, the best, even though Convex did make a video like today or yesterday that basically said that Copilot is actually like in the top 2 for AI review agents, specifically for Convex issues. I don't know if I buy that. Like he does have the benchmark, so you can't really argue it, but I think Copilot is trash and almost always recommends poor things, and like I've manually turned it off for every project that I could. But he says only Claude Opus 4.5 and 4.6 stay above the 50% zero regression rate. Every other model accumulates tech debt that compounds with every single iteration. But once again, it's like, how does that compare to humans? Humans build so much tech debt, and especially because we used to have to write the code manually, we would have to eat the tech debt, whereas now with AI, we can say, okay, fix this tech debt before pushing it, So that speaks to kind of the story we talked with Dax yesterday, one of the leaders of OpenCode, where he said, like, don't move on to the next feature after you finish something. Make sure your feature works really well, and the features that we have are very clean, and the code is very clean. And that's what AI actually enables us to do, instead of just making more slop. When you have, like, that focus on making things very beautiful in a way to have clean code that was not possible for very small teams without major time sacrifices and deliverable sacrifices. But if you're interested, check out this paper. I might check it out later, or at least have like AI explain it to me, not like through a hype tweet, but nonetheless, I thought this tweet was very interesting. Okay, next we have an announcement from Cloudflare developers. I was gonna cover this yesterday, but we ran out of time, so I'll just cover it today. They have a new crawl endpoint for their browser rendering tool. And you can see the idea here is that you can just pass the URL as the only parameter you need, and it will like initiate a crawl job. You get a job ID, poll, and wait for the results. And there was a lot of drama back and forth with this because people were like, wait, Cloudflare is actually supposed to be the one blocking companies from being crawled, so why are they releasing a crawler? It doesn't bypass any of the Cloudflare protections that you have. So there was a lot of like hype tweeting about that was just completely misguided. But nonetheless, if you're building something that relies on scraping that isn't like very complex or blocked by Cloudflare or some other tools that are avoiding AI scraping, this seems like a very solid API that you can just implement very quickly. And I don't know the exact pricing on browser rendering, but I'm sure it's very affordable. So definitely something to check out if you're interested. Next, we have a tweet from Pieter Levels, which kind of goes into like some of the emotions and philosophy that I believe a lot of engineers have had to or are currently tackling in terms of how they feel about coding and how coding has changed in the age of AI, because we no longer write code manually. And he speaks to like this idea of like he misses going to bed with a coding challenge he has to get through and then wake up in the shower, he gets the answer, and he screams Eureka. That was a great feeling back in the day. You know, that was something like very unique to coding as well, I believe. Like obviously like problem solving was the main problem, and that's where it's like, you know, if you're solving leak codes and stuff, you can still have this experience. You don't need to use AI for it. But in terms of like writing software that gets delivered as products, that experience doesn't really exist as much anymore. Now, as opposed to like going inside of your brain to try to figure these things out, it's almost like prompting your way and using discovery with the internet. But even then, it was like the best engineers, I feel, were always like super tapped into all of the available solutions to problems. And it was like the more problems you solved, the bigger tool set you had to solve future problems. And AI is basically like 100x on that, where it's like now you can explain the problem and it can use its pattern matching as opposed to us having to do the pattern matching to figure out what the best solution might be. For example, like the Bloom filters we talked about yesterday, like that's a very fascinating data structure that you can utilize for the specific problem that Vercel had for their redirects. But if you don't know about that data structure or you don't like research the problem very intensely, you won't find it. Whereas like AI, I don't know, like I haven't tested it, but my guess would be like if you ask it something that can avoid false negatives and, you know, can accept some false positives, you would probably end up with a Bloom filter from like asking Claude that. So Pieter goes on as well saying, which I agree with, that you just have to accept the world is permanently changed and it's not going back. That's why you have to be very quick to adapt. You always have to try these new things out and you have to like focus on first principles. That's what people used to talk about back in the day. It was kind of like a buzzword, but I really believe in it as well. It's like, what problem are you actually trying to solve? We're not trying to solve writing code. We're trying to solve people's problems using technology, right? So AI has made that a lot easier. And like he says, just aggressively embrace it and change myself instead. If the fun in solving challenges is gone, where else can I find the fun? And he says like that comes from building things. But, you know, if you're interested in solving problems, like the problems are not gone, you know, and AI is not fully there for solving unique problems. Like it needs that human driver, and the human driver, like we talked about with prompting previously, just makes such a big difference that, you know, if you're creative and you're trying to build things or just trying to solve problems for people using technology, it's never been a more exciting time. The only people who are really suffering are the people that truly prefer to write code by hand. That is becoming a bit archaic, but nonetheless, it does still exist for now. And still deciding what to write, making sure things are good, making sure you refactor and improve things before moving on to the next feature. And just principles in general of engineering, I believe, have become more true than ever. So it's not like the principles have changed, it's just the way that we utilize those principles and the efficiency we have to implement those principles with very small teams has become more efficient than ever. Okay, next we have a quick tweet from Replit. I know people don't really care about these fundraising tweets, but I thought it was very interesting that Replit has raised $400 million at a $9 billion valuation. And it says that Replit is used by 85% of the Fortune 500, which is super interesting to me. I personally don't know anyone that uses Replit, especially professional software engineers. The only people I know who have used Replit, for example, are like vibe coders. But even then, I think a lot of them are hopping on the Claude Code train, and we might have a tweet that we'll cover about that in a second. But nonetheless, very interesting. Amjad is now a billionaire, or like 990 million, assuming that he owns 11%, which seems to be the number that's floating around. And they raised from a ton of different people, including Shaq and Jared Leto. So obviously the celebs are getting in. You know, 9 billion. How much higher are they going to go? Well, Cursor's at 50 billion, which we talked about previously. So there's at least a 5x possible, if not more. And a lot of people are congratulating him. I don't know if Replit went through YC. I believe it did. So it's kind of like another YC success as well. And a lot of people like Amjad. I guess he was kind of like a prodigy coming from Jordan. He migrated to the US and built this whole company. And he was part of Code Academy, I believe, as well, which is an OG learning how to code system. So he's been in the game for a while and he's starting to reap the rewards. And that's very cool. And just staying in touch with the AI industry and what people are building and like kind of these vibe coding tools and where they're headed to building more production software. It's just interesting to like think about where this money's going, right? But a lot of it is just going to be going into human labor would be my guess, because tokens aren't going to cost 400 million and you just need these people who are driving these projects forward. It's not just all going to be AI. Okay, next we have an interesting story for like the military, kind of like creative / warfare focused engineers, or just the people that are just trying to push the limits, where the story was sent to me by a friend of mine But NATO is equipping live cockroaches with AI models to spy on enemies, and they're steering their movement with electric shocks to the nervous system. Each cockroach is wired with cameras, microphones, and microscopic AI chips that process data locally. Swarm algorithms coordinate multiple cockroaches at once, and these cyborgs are sent on military scouting missions through tight spaces, rubble undetected. And obviously there's that whole idea of like cockroaches are really hard to kill, so that might be why they were chosen. But like if you look at these guys, they look like mini Darth Vaders, like it's unreal. But I know a lot of people like this super like futuristic, maybe dystopian, maybe not, projects that people are working on for like warfare and military and security. So just super interesting. I don't know where we're going with this. It's kind of interesting how like we've almost fully captured the like digital bits, where it's like now we're starting to move towards like organic technology solutions, kind of like that Cortical Labs, I believe it's called, the company that is like building a computer with real neurons. Not exactly the same, but just utilizing everything we have available to us on Earth, kind of like on some Elon stuff where it's like, what do the laws of physics prevent? That's the only thing that truly can't be done. And just like crazy world that we're in. So I don't know, if you're interested, check it out. Okay, next we have a tweet from Ara, who's the lead economist at Ramp Economics Lab at TriRamp. And they have this new Ramp AI index, which is basically showing that over the past year, maybe 6 months here is what it's showing, that OpenAI has completely fallen from the first quote-unquote AI check that is coming from enterprises to where they're spending their money on AI. And Anthropic and Claude has just really upgraded their branding and is just basically taking over all of these new companies. All their spend is going to Anthropic. Personally, I'm a huge fan of Claude Code, so I understand why this would happen. And you know, because the technical teams and the engineers usually drive forward new technologies at these companies, besides like hype that kind of goes in reverse. But I do feel like the engineers are the one who gets super excited and they bring it to the stakeholders. At least that's my experience. That's why, because Claude Code is so good, and also because like the $200 max plan honestly is so efficient and gives you so many tokens, it just makes a lot of sense to recommend Claude and Anthropic to the stakeholders and kind of being like the first place they look, because obviously these companies are going to their friends, they're going to their partners and asking, what tool should I be using if I want to adopt AI? And it's just been a complete shift between Anthropic and OpenAI. It's really interesting though, because like obviously a month ago when Anthropic was banning people for using their subscription outside of Claude Code, they had a huge press issue. And, you know, Theo and all these guys were saying how bad they are and how dumb they are. Theo's been on that way for a while. I don't know how he feels about them right now, but clearly they've fully flipped their brand. And it's actually like right around the Super Bowl, it seems, is where like these things have been happening. So I don't know how aligned that is, or maybe it's a bit before the Super Bowl, I guess. But there were those Super Bowl ads that talked about how OpenAI was adding ads to their product. And obviously that doesn't really matter too much for businesses, but this brand recognition stuff and just like making sure that people view your company positively is so fascinating. And just the psychology and all these things, you know, that we've been talking about, where it's like the best practices of the past, you know, for marketing, it's like even the past 100 years or so are more true than ever. And it's like really focusing on how do you make your brand popular? How do you make sure people spend on your company as opposed to your competitors? Obviously, they say not to focus on your competitors of your startup, but you obviously have to understand the landscape and people who are trying to solve problems for the same customers as you. And just super fascinating. And it's always cool to have like open data that we can analyze and try to derive insights from. Okay, next we have a tweet from this guy, He-Man Shu. I haven't heard of him. He just says he's an AI researcher and works on product. So take all of this with a grain of salt, but I found it super fascinating. But there's this product called Terminal Bench. I don't know if it's by him or who it's by, but it does seem like an interesting website that's tracking like how well all of these harnesses work. And essentially what it says is that the Claude Code harness is the worst for Opus 4.6 with an accuracy of 58% on this benchmark compared to these other ones that I haven't heard of. These are very like niche agents, I guess, but this is where you can kind of find like the new alpha if you really like dig deep and want to become super knowledgeable about like the harnesses and the agents that are available. But yeah, Claude Code you can see here is around 58%, whereas like some of these big ones like Junie, which maybe I've heard of, but Obi-Wan, Terminus, Kira, Tong agents, which I haven't heard of at all, Droid, Crux, Mux, they're all in the 67% plus, which is like quite a big difference when you're looking at code. You know, you want to optimize for as few bugs as possible. It is basically saying that Claude Code is actually one of the worst harnesses for Opus 4.6. And they have the link to the terminal bench here. It's tbench.ai, I guess is the URL. And actually, it seems like the company Droid owns the @Droid, so that's super cool. Factory AI kind of sounds familiar. Maybe that's Software Factory. When I was talking about Chamath's company yesterday, maybe I was misspeaking because I think their tool is also called Software Factory. But nonetheless, here you can see on the right the organizations that are involved, and just like super interesting if you're trying to optimize. Personally, I'm not going anywhere from Claude Code for now. I'm a huge fan of it. It really solves a lot of my problems. Maybe I'm not working on the most difficult possibilities, like, you know, when you're planning out missions for the Mars rover. Maybe they want to investigate in researching some of this because the like inaccuracies, quote unquote, is very problematic and like costs a lot more than like, for example, if I just mess up some UI or like have a bad database schema, which would be catastrophic. Like I always want to avoid migrations as much as possible. But nonetheless, if you're super interested in like the deep agentic optimizations, there's a new benchmark that you have available to check out. Okay, and lastly, we have a story about an autonomous agent hack on McKinsey, which is a consulting company very well known for, they're like hundreds of years old, or at least like 100 years old, I believe. You know, they were kind of like a consulting company that you would bring in to do tons of different things. Like they even do like public relations and like tons of different things, but they are also an engineering firm as well. And I remember like when OpenAI was giving out like the billion token or trillion token rewards, they were one. So they've been utilizing AI from the beginning, and I haven't validated this or read more into like the blog specifically, and I don't know about this buff.ly link, but it seems to be just a shortener. Nonetheless though, it seems that there was an autonomous agent hack on their AI platform called Lily, and the scale of data accessible without authentication was massive. So they were able to hack 46.5 million chat messages containing a lot of confidential information, 728,000 files, 57,000 user accounts, 400,000 AI assistants, and 94,000 workspaces, system prompts and model configurations, and then, you know, RAG document chunks and files and agent messages routed through external AI APIs. There was an interesting point as well, as like, why do you have 60,000 employees but 400,000 assistants? Maybe it's just because they're forcing people to try out different things, or they're breaking down different agents for different tool sets or different proficiencies. I know there is still a lot of debate of like what's better, like one agent with different skills or multiple agents focused on different skills. I don't know if there's been a conclusion on that debate yet, but for me personally, I just like using one agent and then having it do everything, because for me it kind of speaks to that principle. I forget what it's called, but it's like you can only know so many people or have so many relationships, so it's like, why would I increase the amount of relationships I have to manage when I just have that one quote unquote person that I can talk to and it just knows everything? That's personally how I like it. But obviously if you're optimizing for performance, there's probably some benchmarks that or studies that refer one way or the other, but nonetheless speaks to, you know, security. Cybersecurity is more important than ever. AI is kind of like a boom actually for cybersecurity, so if you're interested in that field, it's never been better to get into it. And the repercussions of this probably won't be that big, you know, like companies get hacked all the time and they just kind of move on, but it will be interesting to see over time if this turns out to be true, because obviously there could be some over exaggeration here, or maybe like specific information wasn't actually leaked. It was kind of like obfuscated data per se. So we'll have to keep an eye on this, but nonetheless, very fascinating and scary, obviously. And you want to make sure, like if you're vibe coding things, just ask your Claude every single day, do I have any vulnerabilities here? Because it will review better than someone that doesn't know cybersecurity. And if you start to reach traction and you raise money or whatever, never hurts to spend a few $1,000s or a few $10,000 even to bring in an external firm. Or like even Eva, I don't know what's been up with her, but she like hacked Cursor, a bunch of different companies. Firebase was like her main thing, where she would find vulnerabilities with companies using Firebase. Just bring them in. It's not a huge cost and you get a lot of benefit. I don't know why companies ignore cybersecurity so much and they just end up getting hacked. But even like Moltbook, that leaked all their API keys, ended up getting acquired by Meta. So who even knows these days? But nonetheless, interesting story. If this kind of stuff interests you and you want to talk with some like-minded people, join the NATO Discord in the description. Thanks.